Hello, hello. Welcome to the Takedown, subverting power with radical thought. That's going to be our new motto. You're going to hear me say it every day. And today, basically, I think it's been a long time since I've been on. And last month was incredibly long. I think there was 5 Saturdays in last month, and that was kind of shocking. And that means the first Monday would fall even further back. So today is the first Monday, and it's already the 7th. Like the absolutely last day it could be for it to be the first Monday. So we're here today. I'm a little bit under the weather, but I make sure that I put in the time to show up first Monday of every month so we can get this program going and basically bring you my thoughts on the previous month. I'm going to try to avoid the horse race of the election this episode. I'll probably talk about it a little bit, but first I want to talk about some of the things I spoke about the last time I was on Ben's show. I believe Ben had a robust response, and I actually had one too, but my file was corrupted. So we'll have to actually save that for another time. But I'd like to introduce Benjamin Studebaker. Some of you may be familiar with his blog. I read it quite a bit because sometimes, I'm interested in a lot of things he has to say there, and I think our viewers will also be interested in those things. Ben, why don't you go ahead and say hello to the audience?
Hey, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, like I said before the show started, I'm really glad that you decided to spend this time with us because time is precious. You don't get it back, right? So every time someone comes and volunteers their time to come on this show and speak to our audience, I'm very very happy that they're willing to do that and just bring a new way of thinking to our audience sometimes, or just a different perspective. So before, of course, I'm bringing you on because I want to talk about Syria. And I made some comments on Syria that were so out there that everybody was just instantly like put off by it, or it's just out there. And it reminds me of your post that you put out there saying, why the left sometimes has a problem. And I think you outlined that the anti-imperialist message is just not popular in the United States. And can you put that? Can you go ahead and put that in better words for me? I think I summarized it, but why don't you go in there and kind of flesh that out for us, and then put that in the context of Syria, if we could.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So my name is Benjamin Studebaker, and I run a blog at benjaminstudebaker.com. I do a PhD at University of Cambridge in politics. That's what I do. I've had a couple of really popular blog posts that have gotten large audiences, but most of my stuff doesn't go that big. As far as the imperialism question, so I think that there's kind of a distinction in American politics between this kind of more isolationist, more cautionary approach to intervening, where the focus is still on what's in the U.S. national interest, but there's more skepticism about whether interventions will really do us any good, and this more radical anti-imperialist position, which is taken by more people on the left, which argues that we intervene to protect the interests of defense contractors or the military industrial complex or the global capitalist class, etc. That particular message has not been mainstreamed to the same degree that this less intense, more isolationist message has. And that kind of isolationist message, which Bernie Sanders ran on, which Donald Trump to some degree runs on, became more popular after the Iraq War, and when we started to have this view that the Iraq War really wasn't good for most Americans, that most Americans didn't get anything out of it, and that from a national security standpoint, we didn't end up any safer or better off from it. And that view has become something that you can run on, and it's been very popular. But the more anti-imperialist position which Stein has taken, where you want to make very big cuts to the defense budget, has not yet become something that many people are attracted to. And it's kind of the thing where, like, as you said, when you give voice to an anti-imperialist position in American political discourse, people go, what is he on? There isn't a very receptive audience for it yet.
I remember I had Max Haven on, and he was speaking about the radical imagination, and this kind of brings that to light there because that message is not heard very often. when someone's out there expressing that message, it's viewed as something that's not real or something that can't exist, or it's an idealistic position or even a naive position in terms of how foreign policy is supposed to be interpreted. And you'll find that, just like economics, even I'm sorry, just like economics, social sciences are oftentimes corrupted by an ideological bound. And I think that foreign policy is no exception. You'll see scholars speaking about America somehow inherited influence over these people, or America is a reluctant leader in the world, somebody who didn't actually, get its dominance by brute force with a secure plan to attain that dominance, but somebody who just kind of fell into the leadership position or ascended to that position by right or something of that nature. And you'll find that, undertone, you'll find those undertones across, multiple multiple discourses on foreign policy. And I feel like when you have the anti-imperialistic message, you're kind of butting up against that. It's just something new and people haven't heard of it, so it kind of stands out as ridiculous.
Yeah, there's more of it in Europe. There are three mainline theories of international relations in academia: realism, liberalism, and Marxism. And Marxism has a much stronger presence in Europe. If you go to an IR class in Britain or Germany, you would hear some of that perspective. And if you're an undergraduate student studying international relations in the States, you tend not to hear it.
Mm. Now, mind you, most people aren't studying those things, so they're receiving their worldview mostly through the lens of the corporate media, which I believe exists as a propaganda engine for the powerful. And I'll say that all the time because, the more and more you start to become attuned to, alternate forms of discourse and differing views, you start to see how narrow the political discourse on mainstream media really is. But let's talk about Syria. Kind of give us a historical perspective of, kind of what's going on there, and kind of what you see.
Yeah, so Assad is the son of the previous leader in Syria. It's very much a closed system. There isn't much scope for opposition in Syria. But nonetheless, the regime does retain a lot of support from the Alawite Shiites who live in the country because of those patronage relationships I talked about. The Assads have historically delivered enough economically for those people to retain their support. And of course, the army is employed by the government, and those people don't have jobs if the government goes out of power, and they're likely to face reprisals because the other groups in the country that are more hostile to the government are also hostile to the people who have supported it. So there is a real sense on the part of the Shiites who back Assad that if he goes down, they might be victimized, they might get expropriated, they might become the victims of some genocide. The Sunni population in the country doesn't like Assad very much and has been supported in its efforts to overthrow him by Saudi Arabia and other Sunni power brokers in the region. Assad, for his part, has aligned very closely with the Iranians, who are also Shiite and consequently have a bit of a cultural rapport with the Shiites who live in Syria and back then. So during the Arab Spring, a lot of challenges arose. A lot of groups of people in the Middle East were looking to democratize, and some of those groups were looking to radicalize and make regime types that were more overtly Muslim. The Assad regime, while it has some affinity for the Shiites, is not overtly religious in the way that, say, the Iranian regime is. It's still relatively secularized. So there are two kind of general groups that want to kick him out. One would be the pro-Western, pro-democracy Sunnis who tend to be in the minority, the Free Syrian Army, groups like that. And then the other would be these more overtly religious governments that don't like Assad because he's too secular. And there you have the Al-Nusra Front and, of course, the Islamic State.
Now, what's strange? Oh, I was gonna butt in here and ask a simple question. What's strange is, oftentimes the Free Syrian Army label is applied to all the groups as though it was a majority of these groups trying to overthrow the government, and they're all united with one goal, which is for him to leave. Whereas, if that were the case, as you said before the show, he wouldn't be able to maintain power this long without popular support from both a lot of the populace as well as the military.
Yeah. There's been the media has often been talked of the rebels as monolithic, except for Islamic State. They treat Islamic State as separate, and then the rebels are a monolith. But of course, the rebels are not a monolith. The rebels are mostly dominated by al-Nusra Front. Al-Nusra Front is, I think, the strongest of the non-Islamic State rebel groups within that rebel faction. And there's no reason to believe that al-Nusra Front would be particularly democratic. We had the same kind of problem in Libya, where we had a lot of different rebel groups that were aligned against Gaddafi, and we just kind of backed them as a bloc and expected them to work it out after we finished intervening there. And of course, they didn't. As soon as we left, they broke down into their own sets of fights between Eastern Libya and Western Libya, and the people who are more secularized and the people who are more religious. And the same kind of thing is likely to happen in Syria if Assad is taken out tomorrow by some coalition. You have to stay in the country in order to get government stable, and that means a long commitment with a lot of money being spent and a large troop presence, all things that Americans aren't that excited about, which is why Lindsey Graham did so badly in the Republican primaries when he said, "Oh, we're gonna send 10,000 troops over as part of a coalition." Nobody got excited about that.
Mm, mm. Now, this is actually interesting. Now we're getting into this and we're talking. Oftentimes, like you said, the media treats it like it's a monolithic block, and that basically they're fighting for democracy. When in actuality, the people that are fighting for democracy are like a small minority, and they're not the people generally taking up arms against the government, right? They were actually out there peacefully protesting before, and when the government repressed them, the turmoil caused by that gave rise to stronger groups that actually were armed to come in and try to do an arm removal.
Yeah, the Free Syrian Army, the pro-democracy section has militarily revolted, and there are some of them do have arms, but they are not the strongest or the best trained. The strongest and the best trained tend to be the more religiously oriented groups.
Now that is something that we really haven't drawn a really more emphasis on. Like nobody really knows that. That's something out of nowhere. Now it is true that
We don't really talk about the details of it. It's just when we talk about it in the media, it's just ISIS and Assad are bad, and we need to get rid of both of them. That's the narrative.
yeah, and I think I took a lot of heat for saying, in general, it is my position that ultimately the rebel groups are not necessarily going to do better for the people that live there per se. We really don't know, and that perhaps like the UN has recommended, and several peace activists and foreign policy experts have recommended that we perhaps try to stop the flow of arms flowing into the region from at least all of our allied countries, the Gulf states and Turkey and things of that nature, to basically cut off the rebels a lot of their supply lines. And they were saying that that kind of position is not going to solve the conflict. And I think that ultimately it may solve the conflict, because Assad does control quite a bit of the country now. He's been making gains and he's been very resilient. So odds are, they will no longer have the funds or resources needed to fight the state without that continual support from outside regimes. And so I was saying, if you wanted to end the conflict, that could be a solution. And everyone just that just blew their mind. They're like, no, that's wrong, and that's not a moral question or something of that nature. What do you think?
The difficulty is that foreign states have come in on both sides. So foreign
Mm-hmm.
states come in on the side of the rebels, and they've come in on the side of Assad, to a point where we aren't really sure what the balance of strength would be if nobody was involved. There's been so much outside involvement that we don't really know who's stronger at this point.
Hmm.
The Russians have been helping by providing a lot of air support to Assad, which if they weren't providing that air support, maybe Assad wouldn't be making the same level of gains. But by the same token, the Syrian rebels have received a lot of outside help, outside money, outside weaponry from the Gulf states. So it's become very messy. And as long as none of these outside groups is willing to let the other side win, then there can't be a military victory. And what we were really looking at is a negotiation among the different outside groups for a settlement. The negotiation is as much between the United States and Russia as it is between the different Syria factions, because these groups have committed so much arms and weaponry to the conflict that it's almost more like a proxy war between them than it is, at this point, a real conflict within Syria among those factions.
Now, see, I agree with that. Here's my thing, though. I believe there was a peace talk where Russia offered an 18-month constitutional reform period and democratic elections promised. And because of various reasons, the reason given was that since Assad was not asked to immediately leave, that that was not to go forth. And we don't know if the United States was in coalition with the Gulf states or not. We don't know what the reasoning for that reason was, what the true motive is. But I just think that that's interesting for the people who are saying that they want democracy to come to Syria, or the people deserve to decide their own leaders, that this offer was already given and rejected by the United States for whatever reason. And
yeah,
it's
the U.S. wants a precondition where Assad will not be a possible candidate in any election where he will step down.
yeah, and that's and I think Noam Chomsky or another analyst said, well, what kind of regime would agree to some deal where the precondition for the deal is their own destruction?
Right.
And so who would go into a negotiating situation where you're negotiating your own destruction as a precondition? And that's
It would be
just
one
a
thing if they were
non-starter.
militarily losing, and perhaps, Assad, there have been dictators who've negotiated a kind of surrender where they get some cushy treatment and immunity from international criminal courts and things like that. But Assad is not in a position of that level of desperation. So
Mm,
he doesn't have to agree to some kind of surrender package.
I see. I think I think I think that covers like a lot of the things that I said. I did say that he does have support. We addressed that, and I also said that just because I'm pointing out the fact that he does have some support in the country does not mean that I'm saying the country's a full democracy. It does not mean that, they have a fully functioning democracy. That's not what I said. I just said he does have popular support there from people. And, when we're looking at dictators, if we're just saying, well, he's a dictator, we should take him out. There are tons of dictators all around the world. So what's specifically special about Syria? Well, I mean, that's the question I would ask. That's not the question I was asking you. But let's talk about back to what we were talking about, the anti-imperialistic message. If you could put that in context with when you were talking about Jeremy Corbyn versus Bernie Sanders here in America.
Yeah. Yeah. So Jeremy Corbyn has taken a more radical left-wing position on foreign policy than Bernie Sanders took during the primary. So if you remember during the primary, Bernie mostly talked about a continuation of Obama's foreign policy. Bernie said explicitly that he was not against the drone war, and he said explicitly that he would not support further intervention in Syria of the kind that Clinton has talked about, like a no-fly zone. But he didn't talk about rolling over completely on a lot of the positions that the Obama administration has taken in the Middle East. It was maybe a little bit more friendly to Russia than Obama's, but not very much. Corbyn, on the other hand, has taken a lot of very radical positions. He has said that he would like to see Britain leave NATO. He's said that he would like to see Britain promise not to participate in any bombing mission in Syria under any circumstance. He wants to get rid of Britain's nuclear program, Trident. And these kinds of positions, which view Britain as a badly intentioned actor in the Middle East. That's the way that it's perceived, that Corbyn thinks that Britain, when it intervenes in the Middle East, then it intervenes egoistically and selfishly and for its own benefit, and that it would just be better off, that the region would be better off if Britain stayed out of it. Whereas with Sanders, I don't get as much of a sense that Sanders thinks that the United States is out to do harm in the region. It's more that he thinks that the actions that are on the table are not constructive. And so that is a weaker argument that doesn't tell people who in the past have voted for candidates that have supported interventions and who themselves may have supported interventions, that they're part of some kind of villainous or evil project, which I think anti-imperialism often implicitly says. Anti-imperialists say that George Bush and Tony Blair are war criminals. And if you voted for them, you voted for a war criminal. Whereas with Bernie, it's more, no, those guys made mistakes. They were in error. They thought they could accomplish something good, but they couldn't. It's kind of a question of whether you think that the people running these interventions are well-intentioned but mistaken, or if you think that they are exploitative and villainous.
Okay, so here's the thing. I'm obviously on the left where I believe is exploitation and villainous, right? However, what I would argue is if you accept that the government is corrupted, how can you still believe in an altruistic view and how that government treats other countries that it's not responsive to? It almost seems illogical to believe that you're out there trying to do good when, ultimately, throughout societies across our history, we have, usually an elite capture of the state, and then they use the state to put forth their own ends, and that we go through that cycle over and over and over again. So I'm wondering, why does that illusion exist in America, and why is it so pervasive?
Well, there are. Earlier, I talked about two schools of academic international relations theory: realism and liberalism. And I think that oftentimes our government acts for realist reasons. The realists believe that states should act to defend and advance their own power, because by defending and advancing your own power, you protect yourself from enemies. The liberals believe that we should be using international institutions to create a set of norms that allow us to transcend that history of power competition. And I think a lot of the time we act for realist reasons, or for at least what people think are realist reasons, but then the PR is liberal. The PR is liberal humanitarianism. So we will go into a country because we think that that country poses a threat to us, or because we think if we go into that country, we can tip it from a regime that isn't friendly to us to one that is. But then a lot of people will justify that on the grounds that, well, the regime is run by people who are going to massacre their own people, or going to commit war crimes, or are authoritarian, or are communist, or something like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I remember someone said that America's oftentimes, well, first off, let's all be clear here. America at this point is projecting maybe like a global hegemony. It's kind of, I hate to use that word, but that's really kind of what they're doing in a sense. After World War II, they've been on that project for a very long time, and it's within that context that I would say that, to me, that type of thing is unsustainable. No one is able to hold on to supremacy, the way that, the United States kind of pursues it, for extended periods of time. It's always things are always shifting and changing, right? And so they talk about this global stability that's been achieved, and really what that amounts to is almost like an American dominance. And I'm saying, if you continue in this manner, what happens when that dominance is no longer there?
Yeah. It's interesting. When I did my master's at University of Chicago, I took a course with John Mearsheimer, who is an offensive realist. He thinks that states, in order to survive, their best strategy is to conquer other states and get hegemony over regions. And once you have hegemony over your region, then you want to prevent any other state from getting hegemony over their region, so you intervene in other regions, but on his view, only to prevent hegemons from rising. He opposes a more muscular interventionist position, where you intervene in every country to try to make every country around the world friendly to you. And he calls that position a global domination position, which is what he thinks predominates in policymaking. So it's interesting that you can find in our academic ranks a lot of people who do want the United States to defend its position of power, but who nonetheless think that a lot of the stuff that we do is counterproductive or unhelpful toward that aim.
Now that's an interesting distinction, because obviously I was speaking about, viewing it as a world domination strategy, And I actually am partial to having regional powers basically, do their thing. And each region kind of respects the other region in some sense. And within that region, there may be conflict and struggle, but it won't be, a global struggle. I'm kind of, you can reach an equilibrium at that level, perhaps. I'm not sure. That's all theoretical or not here or there. But I like that you brought that up because that is kind of what I believe should be our foreign policy, maybe like a more regional thing. And that would mean, perhaps understanding and respecting other regions. But when someone hears me say that, it's so out there and it's so left field. They're like, what do you mean? No, of course we have to do this because if we don't, someone else will. And I'm like, what? What do you think of that argument that America must dominate? Because if America does not dominate, then someone else will, and who knows what they'll do. I've heard that argument before as well.
There was an old Cold War argument about that between people who believed in perimeter defense and strong point defense. And the perimeter defenders believed that you can't allow the Soviet Union to dominate any one country, because if they dominate any one country, it will be the beginning of a domino theory in which they take over the whole world. And there were defenders of strong point defense who said there are certain areas of the world where we have to prevent the Soviets from having power because they're areas of the world where our allies are located, or where there's a lot of wealth, or it's strategically very important. But in most areas, we should leave it be because it's not worth the resources. And that debate went on within a group of people, all of whom were committed to the project of America being the most dominant country. But it's interesting that the strong point defense position often overlaps in terms of policy output with a lot of people with a more left-wing position who say that you shouldn't go into a lot of different conflicts. So in the case of the Vietnam War, you could find a lot of strong point defenders arguing with the left-wing hippie movement that the Vietnam War was a waste of everybody's time and money.
Now, I had heard, I can't remember where I heard this from, that one of the major drivers for us not wanting to be within the Vietnam conflict anymore was that, I think going in, we expected to make a lot of money from the manufacturing required to fuel those arms, and we ended up losing to Japan and someone else. And so when we lost that, it seemed like they lost a lot of business support for those conflicts. I'm not sure how accurate that is. I'll have to go back and do more research on that. But I had heard that narrative. Have you heard that before?
I haven't heard that particular one before. A
Yeah.
lot of
So
people lost belief that Vietnam was strategically important. They weren't convinced that the United States shouldn't be trying to win the Cold War, but they did become convinced that Vietnam wasn't important to winning the Cold War.
yeah, remember, we would like to think that the activism and protests or whatnot really had a massive effect, and perhaps they did. But it took, the war raged on very violently for 5-6 years before we even saw the first media coverage of the atrocities happening there. And when the media is already covering it, they're doing so with the explicit purpose to engage the portion of the media they control to actually turn sentiment on the war at that point.
Yeah, we never managed to get a president in office who was explicitly against the war. The effort in '68 to nominate someone who opposed the war in the Democratic Party was unsuccessful. McCarthy and RFK and McGovern all ended up losing out to Humphrey. And then Nixon ran on his Peace with Honor platform, but he wasn't committed to immediately ending the war. And that became clear very quickly.
Let me ask you a question about NATO. What is the purpose of NATO? Both the said purpose and kind of what that transformed into, so people can understand. Because you said Jeremy Corbyn wanted Britain to leave NATO.
Yeah. So NATO's original purpose was as an alliance of states to defend against Soviet aggression. That was the idea. It could, from a Soviet standpoint, be viewed as an alliance of states to thwart Soviet aims and to threaten the Soviet Union so that the Soviet Union would not pursue the expansion of communism into other countries in Europe. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there are more questions about what NATO is for. Russia isn't as capable as the Soviet Union was of potentially invading other countries or using infiltrators to change other countries' governments. The Soviet Union in the immediate post-war period did try to help communist movements in Western European countries to a degree, mostly unsuccessfully. But nowadays, Russia is not really in a position to do that. Oftentimes, we inflate the threat Russia poses. Their GDP is smaller than Britain's. They have military forces that are very out of date and not nearly as effective as the Soviet army. So now what is NATO for? Well, if we don't really think that Russia is in a position to invade countries, then NATO must be for expanding the pressure on Russia. So since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've added a lot of Eastern European countries that used to be either in the Warsaw Pact or in the Soviet Union to NATO. And this has allowed us to move our military installations that were used as defenses against the Soviet Union closer and closer to Russia. So Russia interprets this as us treating them as if they are still an enemy. And so they view it as threatening, and they are very hostile to any additional countries that are interested in joining NATO, like Georgia in 2008. Georgia has been very interested in joining NATO, and for that reason, the Russians engaged in a conflict with Georgia in 2008. And more recently in Ukraine, the Ukrainian government began to cozy up with the European Union and with NATO, and the Russians do not want any more countries to go into NATO because they don't want NATO troops moving any closer to the border with Russia.
Now, it's strange that, in the US media, and again, I'll refer to them as the mass propaganda machine, they make it seem as though Russia is always the aggressor. And in our conflicts, they make it seem like Russia is pushing the bounds of containment. Even the idea of the policy of containment on Russia in itself is an aggressive stance.
Yeah.
But what you just laid out is, it seems to me as though perhaps the United States is the actual aggressor.
Yeah, Russia is a declining power. It is increasingly dependent on petroleum and natural gas. And of course, oil prices collapsed a few years ago, and that's really hurt their economy. They've lost a lot of territory and a lot of population relative to the Soviet period. They're not really in a strong position to aggress. We look at Ukraine, and Ukraine has been portrayed as this picture of Russian aggression. But until very recently, Ukraine was a strong ally of Russia. And it was because Russia was getting weaker that Ukraine became interested in leaving the Russian alliance and going over to the West. I think we very often inflate the level of threat that Russia poses. Of course, because Russia is a nuclear power, we can't invade Russia or depose its government very efficiently or effectively, even if we wanted to do that. But Russia's also not in a position to really go after us, because not only does the West have a large nuclear arsenal of its own, but the West has much, much stronger economy and much, much larger military outlays than Russia. If you add all of NATO together and you added Russia and NATO's military expenditure together, Russia would be about 5% of the total. It's not even close to parity.
That is, I'm sure I keep on saying that's interesting, or I'm shocked, but I'm not shocked. These are all things I fervently believe, and I've already kind of read. Really, I'm for our audience, just trying to basically kind of navigate that, and just try to break that down for everybody who's watching the show, that so we can understand that for the most part, everything that we hear on the media about foreign relations and things of that nature is all BS. Most of it is BS, and you're going to have to really dig deep before you can find more accurate narratives on what's really going on in the world, especially in regards to the US and its actions. And I think during the show, I would ask 4 questions. When was the last time the United States stood in the way of peace? When was the last time the United States stopped a peace agreement or a peace accord in some way, shape, or form? According to the United States, according to, the West-oriented media, the United States has never stood in the way of peace. But if you go outside of the United States, outside of the Western aligned media, the United States is the number one propagator of violence and things of that nature around the world. So
it depends on what kind of peace you want. And a lot of the time we go, well, we're not standing in the way of peace, but that's because we're only not standing in the way of the kinds of pieces that we are willing to accept. And I don't want to make it sound like it's only the United States that acts in this way. A lot of other countries also have their own media operations that advance their own points of view. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that Russia today is not every bit as much a mouthpiece for the Russian point of view as our media sometimes is for ours. But you often have to try to look for the balance and try to get past the noise of all medias in all countries, because medias in any country are likely to take the international relations point of view of that country.
Yes. And you'll find that on the BBC they talk a lot about America, but they don't really talk much about Britain. Canada's media is the same thing. So, I kind of frame this like I'm going all against America, and I think I need to kind of back that off. You're right. I need to explain that all institutions in their countries kind of take the view of that country in regards to putting out, a favorable view on the home state and what they're doing in the world. Now, sometimes that may be completely at odds with the reality. Sometimes it may be closer. There's varying degrees of that. But I just think that that's something important that we have to understand. And so when people come with an anti-imperialistic message, it could be that just because we haven't heard it, it sounds bad, but it could be more accurate than what we've been exposed to before.
Yeah, and a lot of people want to believe that they live in a society that's a good society. They want to believe that they live in a state that's a good state, in a government that has good intentions. They, like to think that the people in government are like them and have the same kind of goals and aspirations for themselves and for their country that they have. And so they don't want to believe that these people are up to stuff that they really maybe shouldn't be up to. And we have to be sympathetic to that, but at the same time, we don't want to be naively confident in our institutions that they always do the right thing for everybody.
Now, this is interesting because I asked you about NATO because I remember a long time ago someone stated that the official mission of NATO became to control the global energy system, pipelines, and basically what that amounted to was almost like a coalition to kind of dominate the world per se. And that's why I asked you kind of what do you feel NATO's mission was. Let's go back to talking about selling the message. We're talking about the anti-imperialistic message and, kind of seeing, okay, does it work? Does it not work? I think ultimately, you make the case that perhaps the left should drop the anti-imperialistic message to gain more traction. Kind of talk about that for us, please.
Yeah. So because there are so many people who want to believe that they live in good societies, it's hard to sell them a message which implicitly says that their tax money funds things that are evil, that when they vote for people, they're voting for people who are evil. Those kinds of messages are difficult. People don't like to feel like they aid or abet evil. They don't like thinking of themselves as stormtroopers. If they know soldiers or they know veterans, they don't like thinking of those people as stormtroopers. So it's more difficult to persuade people that they live in a regime that's evil. It is easier to persuade people that they live in a regime that's stupid, where people are making honest mistakes, where they mean well, but they're nonetheless blundering around doing things they shouldn't be doing. I think that's a more persuasive message. So I often try to encourage people to give the benefit of the doubt when they're making anti-imperialist critiques to the people in government and say, well, maybe they're not deliberately being vicious. Maybe they are just making a mistake. Because I think that is easier to go down, easier for people to wrap their heads around.
Okay, and I see that it may be harder to sell someone on a different worldview, but the question, comes down to, let's say you drop the anti-imperialistic message. That's kind of, well, let me backtrack a little bit. Let's say you decided to drop the anti-imperialistic message. I think we've had examples where, in our own country here, the left sort of dropped, well, excuse me, let me say the mainstream left sort of dropped the caring for the poor and being a good steward of the public commons and things of that nature. They kind of dropped that because it wasn't selling at the time. And look at the results that actually, kind of set in motion. Here we are, 30 years later.
Because in this case, we're often talking about the same policy. We want us to not intervene in a country, usually. And we're arguing for the policy we could argue for on anti-imperialist grounds, but we're instead arguing for it on the basis that, well, we can't be sure what the intentions of the people in government are, but it's a mistake. It's not good for us to do this. And so we're still arguing for the same policy. We're just arguing for it in a way that maybe is more appealing. Whereas I agree with you that we should not have triangulated on poverty and welfare, because not only did we change the way that we argued, we changed the policies we supported. And that's a much bigger sacrifice to make. So I would make that distinction between cases where you're changing the argument to make it more appealing and meeting people where they're at, and cases where you're changing the policy and committing your political movement to doing something that is destructive.
Okay, let me ask you this then. If Bernie Sanders' message was continuing in Obama's message, but Jill Stein's message is radically different, there is both a change in the way they're selling it, but there is also a change in policy. While I do, while I do agree that perhaps cutting the military budget by 80% cannot be done top of a hat, right? It's a big ship. You have to start to wind it down. And of course, you have to grow other industries and things of that nature for people to actually have employment and actually make it work as a system. You can't just, turn it around without, unnecessary pain, right, for people. But at the same time, Bernie Sanders didn't actually express those views. He just talked mostly about, wanting to pull back from regime change. So I would say that those are definitely different policies. So what do you think would be the consequences of, let's say, the left dropping anti-imperialism in both policy and rhetoric and going towards a more cautionary thing?
Yeah, I think there's a case to be made that even if you triangulate on mostly just the rhetoric, there would be some policies that would come along with it. We've seen that with Bernie. Bernie didn't commit as much as Stein did to certain kinds of changes that he would not be able to get public support for, or at least that he did not believe he would be able to get public support for. And while that's regrettable, all I can really say is that in terms of public support, Stein did not campaign as effectively. Her percentage in the polls in June, when people didn't know very much about her, was close to 5%, which is the threshold you need to qualify for federal funding for a third party. But by now it's at about 1.8, so she's lost more than half her support. And her favorability figure went from about 24% negative to 38% negative. So the plus minus difference, she was at about -5, and now she's at more like -20. Bernie was able to avoid that because Bernie tried to radicalize the public predominantly on economic policy. And with the foreign policy, he took the best parts of what Obama would do relative to what Clinton would do and emphasized those parts.
Okay, and let me ask you this. How much
program, but it is more electable.
Okay, so if we're relying on polling data, I've actually been in conflict with the polling data, because if you actually look at the methodology behind those polls, it's hard to really draw conclusions because they seem to be manipulated, to say the least. It's hard to really say.
Poll averages. Poll averages tend to average out all of the ways in which individual pollsters screw up, and are usually pretty predictive, at least within a couple points.
And the reason why I say that is because when we had the Democratic primary going, and I hate to keep bringing this up, but there was a lot of issues with, possibly fraudulent results, but somehow, the polls always match those fraudulent results. And you would think that that would be almost impossible, right? If the results are likely fraudulent, there shouldn't be this huge variance outside of the margin of error from the exit polling to the pre-polling and the actual results. But if the pre-polling is matching the results, but the exit polls are very, very far off, it almost calls into question the manipulation of the actual polls themselves. And that was including the average of polls.
The exit polls are not necessarily better than ordinary polls. Exits are just one poll. The poll averages, generally I'm skeptical of the claim that I do think that there were a lot of things during the primaries where there were serious irregularities and voter suppression. I think that happened on a significant scale. That said, I'm not sure it happened to such a degree that it would have flipped the race, because for the polls to have been conspired such that they would portray Bernie as consistently 5 to 10 points behind nationally when he was really ahead. You would need a lot of people to cooperate in that at a lot of different polling agencies. And none of those people would have to care enough about the truth to talk. We haven't heard anybody come out of Gravis or come out of public policy polling or Quinnipiac who has said, oh yeah, we skew the polls because we want to legitimize the result of the election. And because it would take so many agencies working together to do that, I'm skeptical. I definitely think that there were issues, but in some respect, I think it was a mistake for the Clinton campaign and for people who supported it to engage in those kinds of practices, because I think they could have won without them based on the polling figures. And I think by engaging in those practices, they delegitimized the result and created a lot of unnecessary skepticism about it that maybe there wouldn't have been if they hadn't done anything. Because it's very hard to swing an election with rigging. It takes a lot of work. And if you just do a little bit of it, you won't get very far, but you will produce evidence that you tried that will make the result look discredited.
And yeah, I saw your note there, and I think it's interesting that you say that a lot of people would have to cooperate with that and not care about the truth. But when you have a society that's personal interest first, I think that's highly likely and highly possible. If you look at what we found out in these emails, where she's been coordinating with a lots of media organizations and everybody coordinating to put out the same messaging, it's not unlikely for corporate forces or individuals to collude together to produce some end that will make their company more profitable or whatnot. I don't think that it's necessarily impossible or even improbable.
I think in the case of the pollsters, they have a strong financial stake in being thought of as credible, because the pollsters, for those polling firms to make money, they have to produce results that are right with regularity. And I think if we saw emails that said that the Clinton campaign coordinated with pollsters, or
I don't necessarily think it was the campaign per se. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
that kind of clear evidence, I think we have to be skeptical of the broad conspiracy claim.
Yeah, I don't think it would be necessarily a broad conspiracy. I think the word conspiracy gets a bad rep, but anybody who, cooperates with someone else to produce some result that's unbeknown to other people, that's a conspiracy. So I hate to use that word.
Institutional incentives that cause behavior that looks coordinated but isn't. And so sometimes we attribute conspiracies to those kinds of situations, like the media coverage of Trump. A lot of people believe that the media was deliberately covering Trump because they wanted him to do well. But I think what really happened is that the media was in a kind of prisoner's dilemma, where if you cover Trump, you get higher ratings. And if you don't cover Trump and someone else covers Trump, they get very high ratings and you get very little. And so if you're a media outlet that lives and dies by ratings because that's how you generate ad revenue, you have to cover Trump, because if you don't, someone else will, and you'll end up on the short end of the stick. And that logical play went on at each media outlet in the country and individually caused them all to cover Trump, which looked coordinated but wasn't.
Well, what I would say there is a such thing as giving people the news that they want and making the news. And I believe that in the case of Trump, I think they made him news, as opposed to people wanting Trump and them giving the people what they wanted for ratings. I think it's almost like an inversion of what actually happens in American media as of right now. Hey, but I would like to have you on again so we can have a longer conversation. And I don't mean to basically seem like I'm contradicting or anything like that of what you say, but I'm also putting in what I view it as when I have my guests on. But I want to thank you for your time today, and thank you for staying as long as you did. I want to go ahead and give you some time to close out and remind everybody where your blog is located and let them know how they can contact you, and we'll close out.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I blog at benjaminstudebaker.com. Studebaker spelled like the car. You can find me on Twitter, BM Studebaker. That's my handle. And you can find me on Facebook, and I share my blog posts on both Facebook and Twitter.
Oh, David, do we have time for one more question? Can you answer me this? America has a long history of intervening in governments merely that may not have a strategic advantage or anything like that, but merely to keep an example from being set. And when I think about that is when countries try different development models, separate from the ones that the United States prefers. Could you sort of speak to that?
Yeah, there are cases where the United States doesn't want norms to be challenged or precedents to be challenged, and for that reason, people make an argument that the United States should intervene just to defend a norm or a precedent. Like we saw that with the red line thing in Syria, a lot of people used Obama giving that red line statement that if the Syrians use chemical weapons, there will be consequences as a stick to try to beat Obama into a full-scale intervention in Syria. And the Obama administration ultimately decided that even though they had said that, and even though in the view of those people it would erode the norm against using chemical weapons, that a ground intervention or serious intervention at that point in time would not have been in the interests of the country, and so he decided not to do it. But a lot of the time, the president will get pushed by these kinds of arguments into intervening in places where maybe it doesn't strategically make a lot of sense.
Okay, I just wanted to get that out there because that was one of the questions I had written down. It just popped in my head right before you left, so I want to get your perspective on that. Thank you very much, Ben, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, guys, I just want to remind you we just had Benjamin Studebaker on with us, and I'm already out of time, so I don't even have time to have a closing quote of the day. But something that I always go by is when great morals are involved, the majority is usually wrong. Have a nice day, guys, or night.